But what I'd like to do today is maybe reflect a little bit on the work that I've done, mainly with my collaborator of many years, Dr. Ngo Kang Min, who just until last week was with the ASC, but has now moved to new and exciting adventure in her career, without whom I think none of this really you'd actually be seeing. And James LaFranchi from then with the Smithsonian's Center for Tropical Forest Science, and Stuart Davies, the current director. All of these, plus my director at NIE, Professor Leo Tan, and Professor Lee Sing Kong, made all of this possible. So I'll share with you some of the things that we've found over the past 25 years, as well as maybe then reflect on what are some of the changes I've seen in the sort of teaching environment, and how can I remain relevant to the aspirations of the students that we teach. And of course, as David kindly said, there have been hundreds of students over the years, and every year they're the same age, but they really represent, at this point, maybe 3 distinct generations, and these generations are very interesting and very different. And so I'd like to maybe change in the plant community as well as change in the classroom community to end the talk. So again, thanks very much, Susanna, for controlling the slides. If we could have the next slide. My work together with Kang Min and other colleagues like James LaFranchi has been mainly at the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. It's one of the few places where one can see some of the Singapore forests that resemble maybe what some of this looked like in 1819. So the changes have been dramatic, as all of you know, even those of you who don't study forests. It takes no effort really to understand that this dense urban environment is not the same as what it was probably like 200 years ago. So if the next slide will show the plant called Gambier. Gambier was the first large-scale plantation crop. And between Gambier and the firewood needed to process Gambier, it was harvested for its leaves and bark, which are high in tannins, those secondary plant chemicals that are often used in, for example, tanning leather. That was really the first export product from Singapore, and it led to wide-scale forest clearing, not only in Singapore, but southern Johor and the Riau Islands. Everything else that's followed essentially took place on land that was cleared for Gambier, whether that was later plantations or HDB estates or the rest of our urban surroundings. It was really on land that was initially cleared for Gambier in the early 1800s. The next slide will show, I think on the left will be Henry Ridley, the one-time director of the Botanic Gardens, who was credited for making rubber cultivation much more accessible in Malaya. I think it was Ridley who came up with this herringbone type tapping of latex in rubber. And in Singapore, as much as 40 to 50% of the land area, as recently as the 1950s, was covered in rubber plantations. So that gives you some idea of just how pervasive plantation agriculture has been, not just in the wider region, but in Singapore itself. Coupled with that, I think the next 2 slides will show some urban development. I think here is a concept plan for Singapore's development in 1971, and there is a shot of Toa Payoh Newtown in 1967. Now, of course, I defer to people like Kyle Bradley and others who have really taken a really close look at aerial photos over the years from Singapore. But here you can see, I think, beyond sort of at the top end of that shot on the right, you can see vestiges of villages and plantations, and that would have been a traditional landscape that was there maybe for at least a century, to be replaced by a lot of these new towns. The next slide just shows you the remnant forests. This would be the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, and again you can see a 1971 concept plan map, but that Central Catchment Nature Reserve was not set up for nature conservation, but rather for water catchment. And I'll show you a later slide, much later in the slide deck, what those forests look like today. The next slide zooms in on the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, just at the lower, at the south, my God, my directions are bad, southwest corner of the catchment area. That would be, that nature reserve houses perhaps the largest remnant fragment of original forest in Singapore, separated, of course, from the wider catchment area by the Bukit Timah Expressway. I think the next slide will show a satellite photo of Bukit Timah. And next slide, please, Susanna. Thank you. The Bukit Timah is actually a fairly small nature reserve of 160 hectares. So that's just a little over 1.5 square kilometers. Maybe about 1/3 of that nature reserve would be considered original old growth or primary forest, and it's surrounded on all sides by either a road or a condo, a factory, a McDonald's, or all of the above. And it's separated to surrounding fragments by varying, distances. You can see Bukit Batok Town Park on the left, to the west of Bukit Timah, and the central catchment to the east. Now, our thinking about forest fragments, I think this is the next slide, has been largely impacted, rightfully so, by the groundbreaking work of a team from the Brazilian and North American researchers that set up a project. I think the next slide shows an example of this, called the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments, or BDFP project. First set up in the 1970s by Thomas Lovejoy, a pioneering conservationist and ecologist who passed away on Christmas Day last year, just a few months ago. And what they did was this wonderful experiment that made use of Brazilian laws that required cattle ranchers to leave some of the forests in a concession, leave some of the area forested. And what Lovejoy and collaborators managed to do was to convince some of these ranchers, rather than to have one big contiguous piece of forest remaining, to take that 50% forested area and to create islands of forest of varying sizes. And the results of this, again, groundbreaking study, greatly influenced the way we think about forest fragments today. So what were some of the main findings of Bill Lawrence and his team? Well, this slide will just show you some of them. There was very, very rapid and intense loss of big trees, or biomass, from these areas, and also fairly steep decline in species, especially in the smaller fragments. The smaller the fragments, the heavier the impacts. And some of these impacts, Lawrence and other colleagues have really, again, I wouldn't say popularized, they've really inserted into the thinking of ecologists the idea of edge effects, that in the smaller fragments, the area relative to the perimeter starts to decrease greatly. So the perimeter, rather, increases relative to the area as fragments get smaller and smaller. So smaller fragments are impacted by this thing called edge effects, which results really in drying out of the forest, increased light penetration into what should be a dense canopy-covered forest interior. Temperatures are higher. There's direct exposure to the exterior. And again, the smaller the fragment, the greater the impact. Bukitima is the perfect example of a relatively small fragment. So when I arrived in 1989 in Singapore, actually it was on this day, so today is 33 years of being in Singapore. Wow, that's older than many in the audience. Maybe with the exception of Prof. David Wardle, who's maybe 35, 36 or something like that. Bukitima, that is a fragment, and so given its size and the fact that Lawrence and colleagues found that these deleterious, these negative impacts of being on the forest edge, being exposed, extend maybe 300 meters into the forest from the forest edge, would suggest that really just a tiny portion of the core of Bukitima would be not subject to edge effects. But given the size and the configuration of Bukitima, you would say that even in the most remote parts, I mean, remote is relative, of course, because it's only 1.5 square kilometers. But even the most inaccessible parts or less accessible parts of the reserve should be subject to intensive edge effect, and therefore we should expect high biomass loss, rapid decline in biodiversity, and so on. So what did we actually find? Well, so in 1993, a team from the Smithsonian set up a 2-hectare plot, 100 by 200 meters, in primary forest, and 9 years later followed up with a second 2-hectare plot in secondary forest. The primary forest plot, using the Smithsonian standard protocols, involved the measurement of trees and saplings greater than 1 centimeter, 1.3 meters above the ground, otherwise known as diameter at breast height. And we tag, measure, map, and identify all the species, or rely on Jim LaFranchi and other experts to do that. And to date, we've done 7 censuses of the primary forest and 4 censuses of secondary forest, and the most recent one was carried out by our colleague and former student Sylvia Tan, who in her own right has become quite a formidable forest scientist. Let's look first at the biomass. I think that's in the next slide. This is analysis done by Kang Min. She found that Bukitima, if you look at it, it's on the low end of average for biomass for Asian tropical forests. You can see the arrow there pointing to Bukitima, but it's you would not look at that biomass and say it's a catastrophic decline in biomass. It's on the low side of average, but it still compares quite favorably to old, relatively undisturbed forests of Africa, or certainly the neotropics. Possibly because I think the Asian tropical trees tend to be a little taller and larger than their South American counterparts. But nonetheless, despite what was a likely decline in biomass, one would hesitate to call this the catastrophic type of decline you might have predicted from the work coming out of the Amazon. So it's the overall summary of some of these biomass and other findings. I think it's in the next slide. The biomass has largely remained constant over the past 25 years. There has been no net species loss. The tree density and numbers, despite a few drought episodes, has maintained at this level that we found in 1993. So at least in the over the short to maybe medium term, the forest at Bukit Timah has, to the surprise of many, remained quite stable. This was in contrast to what many people told me when I first started on this study. They said, "Don't waste your time. Bukit Timah is this dying ecosystem. It's drying up. They're going to put it in ICU anytime soon." And at least it's been quite encouraging in some of these indicators of forest health. The health check has been reasonably good. Now, another area that's been of interest is of species invasion. So one need only look from, say, the ASE, and you gaze across at the landscape and you see these red flowers. These are beautiful trees known as the African tulip, Spathodia campanulata, and they are wind dispersed. They're opportunistic colonizers of open ground. Many people call that invasive species. Now, in the case of Bukit Timah, if you look, there's a horseshoe-shaped or U-shaped area up at the top, and on the eastern arm, yes, I get my east and west always mistaken. Eastern arm of that horseshoe, you can see that red color. That thank you, Susanna. This is great. So that forest is dominated by a single species, the African tulip, which is an exotic. But that area covered by African tulip really is exactly the extension of dairy farm that was there from the 1950s to the 1970s. So essentially, African tulip colonized the former dairy pasture, the cattle pasture, but has not penetrated into the forest. Now, at this point, David Wardle might have some things to say about invasive species, but because he really is the expert on the subject. But we have found, much to our relief, that the African tulip has not established in the primary or native-dominated secondary forest of Bukitima. So I don't think the fragmentation has necessarily made Bukitima more vulnerable to species invasions. Again, the standard idea is that these destabilized forest fragments then become vulnerable not only to species loss and decay, but also to invasion by exotic species or species of other ecosystems. Here's some other findings in the next slide. So there were two droughts, big droughts, one in 1997, and there was some in the early 2000s. And while there have been some fluctuations in terms of the number of trees, even of even biomass, the levels seem to have, despite these environmental fluctuations, you see the bars represent, you can see rainfall as well as temperature fluctuations during this period. Despite these vagaries of the environment and short-term setback in terms of number of living stems or of biomass, it always seems to have fluctuated around a pretty constant level over these 25 years of censuses. So despite short-term changes in the environment at Bukitima, mortality, biomass, number of living individuals has remained relatively and surprisingly to many stable over this at least medium term, and there have been no directional changes in the forest composition, not in a way that's immediately obvious, although I'll talk about that in a minute as well. What's also nice is that the edge of this forest does not seem to be fraying. It doesn't seem to be retreating to be replaced by a more disturbance adapted vegetation type, which we call the pioneer species or secondary forest. So that, again, that's kind of surprising. Some other findings, and maybe the third bullet point might be most relevant or interesting to some of you. It's that there have been changes. Some species have done markedly better, including the tree shown in the photo. This is Soraya Forest, kind of the iconic, the most common large tree at Bukitima. In a recent conversation, somebody asked me, what's my favorite tree? And I had to say, I think it has to be, I love them all, but I think it has to be this tree, Soraya Forest. First, because Bukitima, over the past 30 years, is maybe the forest I've spent the most time in, and Soraya Forest is maybe the iconic species of that. So just through that long association, that is my favorite tree. It's done well. It's increased in numbers of about, maybe a 20% increase in number of individuals over the past 25 years. Some have increased even more. Likewise, though, some species have declined quite precipitously over the past 25 years, as much as, some species may have 40% fewer individuals today than there were in 1993. And so then the question is, what is driving this change? And that's some of the work that's being undertaken by final year project students like So Sun Yi, work done by Ngo Kang Min in collaboration with Perrine Hamel, and a few other really interesting studies to try to better get a sense of, okay, there are these changes, but what are they in response to? Okay, so we don't have the forest collapse at Bukitima, but I think two slides from now we'll ask maybe about forest recovery. So Chua Siu Chin, another former Smithsonian, well, she's still associated with this work at Bukitima, but she did the first census of secondary forests. She now lectures at the National University in the Bachelor's of Environmental Studies program. She found that even though there was fairly rapid forest recovery in places where, recovery meaning forest cover, you get a closed canopy where once was agricultural land. She found that within 60 years of abandonment of many of these orchards and agricultural areas, you get a nice closed canopy forest. The subsequent return of the plants from the adjoining primary forest is very slow. So even after 60 years, it's very clear where you are, whether you're in the original smaller confines of the Bukitima Nature Reserve that was established in the early 20th century, or if you're in the expanded Bukitima Nature Reserve, which included some of the old abandoned land. Very clear. It's like you're on a path that marked the old boundary. Turn to the left, you can see the large trees and much more diverse primary forest. Turn to the right, looking downhill, and you see a much impoverished forest. It's a forest, and it is closed canopy, and it's valuable from a conservation point of view, but there's no mistaking that for the original forest. So again, that sparked a whole nother series of projects, some done by ASE students, which is trying to understand why is it that the recovery of this forest, while rapid at first, seems to just be kind of arrested in arrested succession, so to speak. Kangmin and Xiuqin have very lively debates about whether it's leaf litter, soil nutrients, limitation of dispersal from the primary into the secondary forest. It could be all of the above, but I think a young clever person or a youthful clever person could still step in to sort it all out for us. I think the question then is, how resilient are forest fragments? I think the conclusion one might take from the Bukit Timah work is that they don't necessarily follow the neotropical norm of instantaneous or rapid biomass collapse and species loss. The decay might be a little bit more gradual. But there are other questions that one could ask about Bukit Timah and similar forests. One would be, what happens when you maybe have the forest, but you lose many of the animals in the forest, what's called defaunation. So the next slide will just show, these are photos that some of my friends from Malaysia Nature Society sent to me, but these animals, the banteng, which is kind of wild cattle, tiger, this is the rhinoceros hornbill up at the upper right-hand corner, the leopard. These actually would have been found in Singapore, probably walking around what is now the NTU campus once upon a time. And all of these creatures, well, not the hornbill, it can fly, but these others swim easily. The Straits of Johor would be nothing for them to cross. And so one could imagine forests like the forest at Bukit Timah, or really the whole region, having a full complement of animals that would include some of these really important megafauna. Some are predators like the tiger, some are herbivores like many of the deer and wild cattle. Many others would be important seed dispersers or maybe pollinators. So what happens when we take away animals from the forest? Now, if we compared just some of these biodiversity studies that have been done by others, both at NParks and with the Nature Society over the years, complete inventory of certain groups of organisms was done first in the early 90s and then more recently in the teens, the 2014 to 2018. And they found that of these groups that were intensively surveyed, plants, birds, mammals, butterflies, beetles, there were slight declines. So in other words, we are still losing species at Bukit Timah, possibly because of the limited, this fragmentation effect. Not, again, at a catastrophic rate, but people like, say, John Asher, a bee expert at the National University, said that at the Bukitima Nature Reserve, many bees that one would expect from Asian, old-growth forests were absent from Bukit Timah, but they were present in the adjoining, much larger Central Catchment Nature Reserve. So Bukit Timah has been impacted, and there are species declines. To what extent does that translate into the function of the forest? It's processes such as dispersal and pollination. So there were some I think I got the slides mixed up, but essentially, some analysis done by Kang Min and also before that by Ku Min Sheng suggested that many plant species that one would expect to be clustered, lacking its, have lost their seed dispersal agents, and therefore they should be found more clustered in the forest, actually were as widely distributed as the same species would be distributed in forests that were not subject to loss of species. Can I say that in a clearer way? I probably could. The effects of defaunation, animal loss, on dispersal seems not to have been so badly impacted as one might have predicted, and has also been found in some other forests. And it could be that other species are taking up the slack, smaller animals like this squirrel that are doing what's called secondary dispersal, not taking the seeds directly off the tree and moving them around, but rather taking seeds that have fallen to the forest floor and then dragging them away, maybe forgetting where they were, and so leaving those seeds to regenerate. So that's another thing I think that really needs a bit more work done, secondary seed dispersal. Some work being done at NTU by Norman Lim at the National Institute of Education is moving in this direction, but there are others, I think, with similar interests. I think the next slide will show perhaps, this is really interesting, and this is where the work of David Wardle and Kenny Pung comes in. But when sometimes animal loss is indiscriminate, non-discriminatory, so maybe large herbivores are eliminated, large predators are eliminated from the forest. So too are large seed dispersers, such as gibbons, for example, or some of the mouse deer or other species that are known to carry big seeds around. But at the same time, seed predators are also reduced. So to maybe, to what extent is seed dispersal loss compensated by seed predator loss as well? But one thing that might shed light on this is the work on wild boar exclusion by David Wardle, Kenny Pung, and Matthew Luskin. The wild boar are back. They weren't at Bukitima in the 1990s, but they definitely are there today. And to what extent, has the return of the wild boar impacted, or will it impact the long-term dynamics or change of the forest? And now that they can go after seeds and saplings in a way that the forest had not experienced for many decades, when the wild boar were completely eliminated from Singapore. The next slide maybe it's kind of meant to be an analogy. I'm not sure how good an analogy really, but if you took a Dodge Charger, so the reason I put that is because that's the car I first started driving. It was my father's car, and by the time I inherited it, there's a lot of rust, some missing parts. Duct tape seemed to kind of hold much of the car together, and I have to confess I contributed to much of the damage myself when I was 16 years old driving my father's car, but it still worked. And maybe 10 years later we saw the car again, and it was really just a rust bucket, missing parts, but it was still, I guess it was roadworthy enough to get the permit to be still on plying the road. But then that led one to think, well, how much of a car could we take away before it stops functioning as a viable transport? So the headlights you could remove. It wouldn't be advisable, but the thing could still work. You could take off the windscreen wipers, maybe in the windscreen itself, remove the doors even. Again, highly inadvisable, with much less room for margins of safety. But essentially, if you had a chassis, wheels, and a serviceable engine, the car could get you from A to B. And I guess the ultimate expression of this stripping down of an automobile might get you the Flintstone mobile, where it's basically, courtesy of Fred's 2 feet, that the car can still move around. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the Bukitima Forest is by any means the ecological equivalent of the Fred Flintstone car, but it's certainly not an intact ecosystem. Many parts have been lost, but it still appears as if, at least in some major ways, the forest is still able to function similarly to a much less disturbed system. And I think more detailed work being done by Kelly Anderson, Eleanor Slade, David Wardle's lab will shed much more light in a much more specific way than me just saying it's a forest that's lost its parts. Kang Min also has made major contributions. There are a few other interesting things that I think that ramifications of this fragmentation work. I think the next slide will demonstrate, and I'll just try to explain really quickly. This was done. I did a little bit of work here, but the real work was done in Ted Webb's lab at NUS. He studied a tree called Kumpasia, otherwise known in Malay as kumpas. It's a very tall emergent species, only lives in old mature forests, such as the central catchment around Makrichi, Bukitima Nature Reserve. You can find a few trees in the remnant pocket of forest at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. I've shown this to Hei Lim in class. Kumpasia is tall forest emergent. It's pollinated by the large Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata, which is known to fly quite a few kilometers in search of flowers to forage. The lines that move back and forth represent the movement of pollen. So this is a genetic sort of fingerprinting type study where from the genetic profile of a plant seedling, we could identify, the team could identify who the mother and the father, the pollen donor, were for any seedling found in any of these Singapore forests. And interestingly, the upper panel shows movement of pollen from the forest around Makrichi. There were a lot of plants that were at Bukitima Nature Reserve fathered by trees in Makrichi, and even some seedlings in the Singapore Botanic Garden. Their pollen parent came not from the Botanic Gardens nearby, but from Makrichi, and even in the middle panel from the Bukitima Nature Reserve. So these honeybees were moving rainforest pollen from one rainforest pocket to another, often across a very, very, quite, relative to the size of a bee, I suppose, quite vast landscape. There was even a case of some trees in the Botanic Garden fathering or donating their pollen to a recipient over at Makrichi. So, I think this has some clear implication for the conservation and management of our landscape, both the natural forest fragments as well as our city in nature, as we call it now. So I think this is a nice outcome of some of the work we did at Bukitima. I think the next slide just shows more generally there are these pockets of old forest, say for example Bukitima Central Catchment, Singapore Botanic Garden. Some animals are able to connect these fragments genetically just through the movement of pollen. Another animal that does this quite successfui for a limited number of species would be the cave nectar bat. I think it's shown in the next slide, this photo by Nick Baker. There's a colony that lives near the Bukitima Nature Reserve, but there are days where you could actually be in the heart of downtown, say for example near the National Museum, and you will find cave nectar bats flying all the way into town to pollinate some of the trees there from their home at Bukitima. So again, for a limited set of species, fragmentation, at least from a sort of genetic a deal breaker, at least in terms of genetic continuity. It is for some though. So this slide is showing the work of Frank Reint's lab at NUS. So I think I should show you, let's focus on the short-tailed babbler. That's this bird it's, of all the 6 birds, it's the one furthest to the left. This is always found in the forest understory. You'll never find it up in the canopy or it's always on the ground, near the ground. And actually, the central catchment area, if you see, there is a reservoir called the Lower and Upper Pierce Reservoir. So those are the ones that essentially cut across the entire central catchment from east to west. Starting with yes, that's right, Lower Pierce is to the east, and then the large one is Upper Pierce on the left. It's also the Kallang River, basically, is the Pierce Reservoir. Those 2 reservoirs essentially cut the forest into 2 halves. There is a tiny sliver of forest on either side, And so most animals who move through the forest are able to negotiate. But in the case of the short-tail babbler, that bird on the far left, Frank Wright's team actually found that the short-tail babbler on the northern half of the central catchment is genetically distinct, quite divergent in just 100 years from the populations to the south. There are some species for which forest fragmentation really is quite serious, and it prevents the movement of individuals. So to assume that all birds can most birds fly, but not all birds that fly will fly long distances. Even a break of 10 meters of open space like a road will deter some of these understory species from moving. So that would also impact the species on which some of these birds, that some of these plants, for example, or insects that might have a relationship with some of these animals. So there's so much interesting work still left to be done. And of course, I make no claims to have done much of it. But I think the questions that remain, as basic as they are still many, as my colleagues David and Eleanor and Kelly and Kangmin could tell you. I think what we could, if we could skip just a few slides, Susanna, to maybe the next one. This again shows the slow recovery of secondary forest in Bukitima. Again, forests that have developed side by side to the original old growth forest still are distinct after 60 years. But in fact, I think the next slide will show a map of the central catchment. And over the years, I have done a little bit of work in some of these dark green patches in the central catchment, which represent the fragments of original forests. So you can imagine in 1850, that central catchment today, which is completely forested or almost completely forested, would have been just a series of small little stands of original forest separated by vast expanses of agricultural land, which upon abandonment became the secondary forest that we see today. And the McRitchie Reservoir, for example, is 160 years old. These are old forests, not just the original remnants, but even the stuff that has regrown in the abandoned agricultural land. Those forests are 160 years old. But even today, you can clearly see the distinction between primary and secondary forests. I wouldn't say like night and day, but spending 20 minutes with an ecologist, you'd be able to quickly discern which is which. Is this the original forest or is this the regrowth forest, even after 150 years? And what's kind of interesting is whether in Bukitima or these small fragments in the central catchment, there's a series of primary forest species that predictably are able, more so than their fellow primary forest cousins, to actually establish in secondary forest. So our FY final year student Jesse Gan a few years ago tried to look at the characteristics or functional traits amongst these successful colonizers from primary forest in secondary forest, with some equivocal results, which I suppose means that there's at least room for further work in this field. And always there are new discoveries. Here's my colleague Nick Faizu, who's been our chief botanist in our projects at Bukitima. He alone has found at least 10 previously unrecorded or species thought to have been extinct at Bukitima because he just looked a little bit more closely. Hanguana neglecta C. This is even, I wouldn't call it embarrassing, but it's interesting. All botanists or all ecologists in Singapore have for the past 150 years walked past this tree, bush at the Bukitima Nature Reserve. And it took Mati Nisalo and a few colleagues at the Botanic Gardens to just 3 years ago say, wait a minute, that's actually a new species. It's never been described before. So, whether sloppiness is a characteristic of botanists, I don't know, but there's still a lot left to be discovered. A few more slides just to show. This is a excerpt. This is a page from C.F. Symington's magisterial book on forest trees of Malaya, the Forester's Manual of Dipterocarps. And in this, he describes the different distinct habitats that are and the trees that characterize them from this iconic family known as the Dipterocarps. So I think one forest type is called the coastal hill, the second from the bottom, there. And there's a few species again of these old growth tree species that predictably occur in coastal hills, such as at Bukit Timah. And I think the next few slides just show coastal hills. They're not restricted by no means to Singapore, so I think they're just aerial captures of from Google. So the Bukitima Forest is an example of coastal hill dipterocarp forest. But if we keep looking, the tree that I said was my favorite, the Soraya criticii, or Soraya. I think in the next slide, Susanna, it shows, oh, sorry, the next slide actually. Finally. Soraya, very easy to find. It has a white canopy. So all of those white splotches there that look like maybe cauliflower, that's actually Soraya criticii, and they're always gregarious. They're found on the ridges. So they define, they define basically they show where the ridges are in these coastal hills. So this is Tanjung Tuan at Port Dickson in Negeri Symbilon in the peninsula. I think the next slide will show other coastal hill forests. Look at these fragments. It's just like Bukit Timah, isolated pockets of primary forest all up and down the peninsula. You find it in Sumatra and Borneo. Unfortunately, that's the state of forests today in much of these coastal areas. But then if you look to the next slide, again, I think this is in Negeri Symbilon. You can see 5 big patches of Soraya criticii. See, Susanna picks them out straight away. She's a volcanologist, right? It doesn't, anybody can recognize. I mean, Susanna Jenkins is not an anybody. She's a very trained eye, but still, never met Soraya before today, but can pick it out. And I think if every slide subsequently, you can actually see a Bukit Timah-like forest. I think the next one, again, this is clear as day, you can see it. I think the next one is a forest found we're going to go around the peninsula. The next one is Batu Pahat in Johor. So if we go to Batu Pahat, I think the next slide might show it. There, look, there's Soraya criticii everywhere. So, we could easily take the work done in Bukit Timah and ask similar questions of forest fragments along coastal hills, all up and down the peninsula or coastal areas of Borneo. This is in Pulau Pangkor off the coast of Perak, and again, you see it's a Soraya criticii or very Bukit Timah-like forest. Even if we go to Penang, I think the next slide, I think we're going to look at a huge chunk of Soraya criticii at the limits of its distribution, a very Bukit Timah-like forest. So I think there's a lot to be, we can take some of the lessons that we've learned from here and compare it with similar studies or conduct similar studies elsewhere. And I think we'll get a much better understanding of the resilience and future of this ubiquitous part of our landscape, and unfortunately ubiquitous part of our landscape, the coast forest fragments. I think the last couple minutes I'd just like to, this is much. Please visit these forests; they're fantastic. And now that we can travel a bit more, the last couple things I wanted to talk about, it'll just take a minute, is my role as a teacher over these past 30 years. So I've done this work at Bukit Timah. It gives me a lot of hope to think that maybe some of these fragments of forest are not necessarily gone cases, as they would say locally, but actually do have a future and have high conservation value. So whether this would be the Mentawai Islands off the coast of Sumatra, or the Pulau Pangkor Islands off the coast of Perak, these forest fragments are interesting and have interesting important conservation value. The forest might have been constant over the past 30 years, but certainly my students have not, because there are generational changes. And also in 30 years, I've seen forests that I have explored as a grad student first coming to the region completely replaced by oil palm plantation or other developments. And so then the question becomes, as a person who teaches ecology, to what extent should I be teaching ecology, and is there room for kind of conservation-related values to come in? It's of course my job to teach the principles of ecology, but at what point does habitat loss and the loss of this incredibly important and magical biodiversity become noteworthy enough to share time with some of the ecological principles. I wrestle with that every week when it's time for lectures. Maybe the other thing is, I think if you look at the student profile today, what's really been interesting about Singapore and the region really is the youth that will speak out. When I first joined NTU in the early 1990s, you would never have students petitioning university administration to divest from fossil fuels, for example, and our students are doing that today. And I think activism and playing an active role in civil society is an aspiration that many students have today that maybe they had before but were unwilling or afraid to express. And again, to what role has my job as an educator, does it require me to actually help? I don't want to tell students what to think or who to talk to or who not to talk to, but at the same time, if activism is part of what they see as being a student in the 2020s, then should that be my role, or should that be the role of academic department? Should we have a community liaison type person to allow to facilitate these other wider, maybe complementary aspirations of students beyond just the academic? I think the next slide just shows an example. How many of us knew that there was a group of ASE and other students with a proposal to revegetate the campus to provide habitat for critically endangered species? They've called this proposal N-Tree-U, and it's gaining some traction not only amongst NTU faculty that they've approached, but also within the wider biodiversity community. To think that these students did all of this and did a great job makes me feel redundant in a way, but also it makes me think, could I have done a better job to help them through this process so that they could have spent less time digging around for information and really focusing on the guts of their presentation? So I think many of you in the audience are in the early stages of your teaching career, and at some point you will reach the later stages of your teaching career, as I have, and you will find that the students change over time. And how do we respond to the changes, not only in the academic content of what we teach, but also in the sort of the cultural environment or milieu of what our students experience? I think that's a really interesting. I won't be around to see many of you in the later stages of your career, but I think it's going to be an exciting ride, and I hope it will be a much smoother one than riding the Flintstone mobile. At this point, I think I should end, and I want to thank Susanna and Hei Lim particularly in particular for giving me this opportunity. I know usually it's very high-powered researchers who do this, and the chance to actually share the kinds of more general things that I do is such a privilege. And again, Hei Lim and Susanna, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for spending a lunch hour to sit in on this presentation.